Hey there, it is Faith Talk Live. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
There he is, Joel Malm, one of our favorites, author, speaker, podcaster. He's got a podcast.
Texan. You forgot to throw Texan in there, Rick.
Yeah.
Yeehaw.
Pardon me. Listen, if we don't have Texans on every week, poor Dan, he gets down about it. From San Antonio, live from San Antonio, there he is, Joel Malm. Joel, what's up?
Hey, guys. Good to be back with y'all.
Good to have you back. And like Rick said, we can never have too many Texans on. I was a San Antonioite. I don't know what we call them. San Antonians. Yeah, I don't remember. Anyway, I was one for 4 years. So yeah.
Texas is pretty much as close to heaven as you can get on this side of the
it really
continuum. So you need to get back in touch with the mothership from time to time.
Joel knows, Rick. He knows.
Now, wait a minute. Are you from Texas?
No, not really, but you know.
But you're living in Texas.
No, that's not true. I was born in Texas, but I spent most of my childhood in Guatemala. So
that's right.
I'm what you call a third culture kid. So.
Ooh, third culture kid.
Yeah.
That sounds official.
As I mentioned, he does a podcast with his dad, and I love the podcast. Him and his dad the content is amazing, but just their flow, they just flow so well. Being and no offense, being non-broadcasting or entertainment people, you guys have really put something together that is entertaining, but yet ministers at the same time. And I love it. So if you can check that out, their podcast. You used to do them on video. Do you still do them on video? Are you still recording those on video?
You know, I've got more of a face for radio, kind of like you guys. So,
a lot like us, you mean, not kind of like.
We've been doing video, but it's so much work. But starting in January, we are going to go back to video. So it just takes so much, it takes four times more work.
Right.
And I'm just not into work. So
I'm just not into work.
I love that quote.
Wait a minute. So he says, because he is not only an author, speaker, podcaster, Texan, a minister, but he's opening up a retreat center. And this is a vision he's had for a while. We talked about this, I think, a few months back. And that's not easy work either, is it? What's going on here?
Rick and Dan, I nearly have died multiple occasions. This project has overwhelmed me. Sometimes there's a fine line between faith and stupidity, right? And I feel like I've looked at this, Lord. I'm like, Lord, I really feel like you told me to do this, but was it just my own hubris? Is it just my own stupidity, my own arrogance that thought I could pull this off? We bought 16 acres in the hill country. It's beautiful out here, about an hour west of San Antonio, hill country of Texas, super famous. We got rivers out here. We got beautiful hills. But we bought some land, got this beautiful hill. We're like, we're going to build on there. Little did I know that hill is pure rock. Jesus called us to build our house on a rock, but dude, that ain't easy. Figuratively and literally, especially if you want plumbing that's underground. So we've had to cut through rock. I don't know what I was thinking. If I had known then what I know now, I would have told the Lord, I love you and all, but call me to do something else. But we're about a month away from opening. We've got 4 cabins. It's going to be for missionaries that are in town. My dad's missions agency is in Kerrville, Texas, and got missionaries I think it's got 800 missionaries all over the world. So they're coming and going. And then we're going to have a place for pastors where we can do retreats, and I can do some retreats based off of the content in my books and helping pastors write their own books.
That's so good.
Yeah. So we've been doing that, but man, it's crazy because I have my white collar days, which are Monday, Tuesday. That's when I write. And then I put on my gloves and my overalls, and Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday is my blue collar days. And man, it's been a beast of a project. So I guess I say I don't like work, but especially right now, I don't like work because I'm sick of work.
Well, especially if you're trying to dig into rock. I mean, because when we lived in San Antonio, we couldn't dig anything because it was just rock right underneath. And unless you have special equipment, it's not easy to do.
There's this giant rock saw that rents for $900 a day, and it just literally sits there grinding through the rock. It's a wild thing to watch, but man, it is it. And the diamond teeth on it cost like $700.
Yeah.
So when a tooth falls off, and you're like, oh, that's gonna hurt.
Yeah. Hey, and if you're watching, you can tell. I mean, Joel's got some sun on his face. He's been out there, so he's telling the truth. I mean, he's out there digging doing the work. Usually people have other people to do that, Joel. What was
those are people with money. I don't have any.
Hey, but how cool, right? Because I mean, you talk about it, missionaries and pastors, they need retreat. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They need time to just relax, not have anybody draw off of them, because that's their lives, right? It's draw, and then they get wiped out and burned. You hear that all the time. Still, ministers and pastors, missionaries punching out because it's hard work. Jesus called it labor. It is labor.
The last 2 years have seen it even worsen.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But the retreat for those folks. So wow. How cool is that? So you said what? It'll be ready in September?
Well, we got one open. We actually have a guy coming to test run it tonight. It's our soft opening of our first cabin. Last week was a soft opening of the first cabin. Didn't go so well because about day 2, they wrote me and they're like, hey, you got hot water here? I'm like, what? The hot water's not working. So I had to go delve into it. And
wow.
Anyways, we got it fixed. But there's just so many. It's not just one cabin, or rather, my wife said don't call them cabins. People think that's some rustic thing in the woods. These are actually quite posh. So the cottage in the cottage. Yeah. So the cottage is we got them ready almost, and So and we actually moved out onto the property, sold our house, moved into an RV to make this thing happen. And
wow.
The RV was short-lived, but we've got a place we can live now. So
that's good.
It does have a romantic sound to it, but I mean, it's like, wow, living in an RV. But I think after a few weeks, maybe less for me and my family.
That's a tight space.
I'd probably brought up on charges and be put in prison because I think we would kill each other.
Well, I like being married, so I figured out pretty quickly. I'm like, if we want to keep this thing together, we're going to have to figure out an alternate plan. So the Lord provided, but yeah.
For the cottages.
Yeah.
For the cottages.
Well, too, and I mean, this, in all this, you're going to get so much stuff to be able to minister to people and to write about, because I mean, even the rocks in San Antonio, I mean, I know that you guys you're going to bring something out of that's going to be like funny, but also deep and spiritual so that folks can relate, right?
Yeah, I've already got a book in the works. It's called What Doesn't Kill You Make You Stronger. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, the verse, the thing that keeps coming back to my mind is the Lord just kept telling me, you have to build it.
Yeah.
Like we all want the final product. And I see that in our lives. Well, here we go. I'm gonna go deep. You ready? I see that in our lives. We all know kind of what we want, but the fact is it doesn't happen by default. You literally have to build it. Jesus said, those who take my words, use them. It's like a man who builds his house on the rock, which is really hard, FYI.
Mm-hmm.
But the things he asks us to do, they're hard work, but the results are, it's the results. It's the stuff nobody sees that brings the results everybody wants. You see the guy that's ripped and like, man, I want that. You're like, yeah. Well, while you're sitting there eating Cheetos and watching Dancing with the Stars, the dude was at the gym, right?
Yeah.
So, but you didn't see the gym. You just saw the ripped dude and you're like, I want that. Well, you got to build that. Yeah. So that's the thing that keeps coming back to me. I'm like, I'm lamenting and moaning at God for what he dragged me into. And he's like, we build it together. And so that's been a lesson I've been learning this year.
That's good stuff though, man.
That is good.
I was just thinking last night, my son and I were watching America's Got Talent, and there's this couple
Cheetos on your shirt.
Anyway, we were watching it, and there's a couple on there that does this whole flying thing, and the dude is ripped, and I mean ripped. And I'm thinking, gosh, I wish I could look like that. And I thought, he probably works out 24 hours a day. You're right.
No carbs ever. Yes. Yeah.
No fun. Anything. No
Cheetos.
Yeah. I mean, just
But he got his 15 minutes of fame.
He did, and he looks good doing it. So whatever.
There you go. Joel Malm with us. We love hanging with him. We talked. Gosh, it was back in 2020, I think, when we first got together. Love Slows Down was the book there. How to keep anger and anxiety from ruining life's relationships. Now, I didn't know this until today. You actually wrote a fiction book. It's called Guided by Thunder. And Thor somehow is involved in this, or a guy that thinks he's Thor. Or
Chris
something.
Hemsworth?
That's right. Yeah. So there's when I was, I usually do outdoor adventures around the world, but COVID shut that down for a year. Nobody's letting us travel. So one of my favorite hikes we do is the Inca Trail. It's a 4-day hike to Machu Picchu down in South America. And I thought, well, if I can't hike it this year, I'm going to write about it. So I wrote about this guy, Everett Anderson. He lost his job because he was non-essential during the pandemic. Then his marriage fell apart. He's about to lose his home. And finally he's like, forget it all. And just kind of throws caution to the wind and buys a ticket to South America to go to Machu Picchu. Well, while he's there, he's kind of distraught. He's just like, I'm going to start over with my life, I guess. And he ends up meeting this guy named Torgrim. And Torgrim is actually a real character that saved my life on a volcano when I was 12, but we won't tell that story. But
wow.
And so I named this guy. He's this giant Norwegian guy, and looks like Thor, and he's kind of slaps Everett around and makes a man out of him essentially, and takes him. He says, instead of taking the train to Machu Picchu, why don't you hike with me? So they hike over 4 days, and he learns these 4 truths that kind of revolutionized his life. So it's a short little book called Guided by Thunder. And it was something I wrote during the pandemic just because I couldn't hike. But so it's a guy hiking the Inca Trail. So it's like experiencing the Inca Trail without actually having to go hike it.
Wow.
So yeah, it's
Very
on
cool.
audiobook, digital, all those things. I've actually got a follow-up I'm working on right now where a guy goes to Israel, and his wife can't go on the trip. So he ends up going by himself. And this guy's already a little bit mad at the church, and ends up going to Israel, and Torgrim shows up and hikes him through Israel. Cause that's another hike I do, is a hike through Israel. So it's based on hikes I do. And my character Torgrim, he's the guide. So
the guide.
Yes.
Very
wow. That's
cool.
pretty cool. How did you start off into all this? I knew you because you had mentioned something about adventures last time or the time before, and you just kind of touched on it. You really didn't get, in deep, but how did this all begin? I mean, you said you started at what, 12 and somebody saved you. So how early did this all start?
Yeah. So I got a book coming out in March 2023 on Salem. It's called Connecting the Dots, where we look at the circular pattern of life, how you kind of keep coming back to these themes over and over again. Psalm 23 says, the Lord is my shepherd. He leads me in paths of righteousness. That word path is this weird Hebrew word magol, and it means paths made of circles. And people are like, what the heck does that mean? And there's all these theory about it. I think it just means God keeps taking you around the same stuff over and over again, but expanding it out like a spiral as you become the fullness of who he made you to be. And one of the themes in my life has always been mountains and mountain climbing. When I was 12, I climbed this volcano, and a horrible experience, but I got me excited about mountain climbing. So when I was in college, I climbed a mountain in Russia, Mount Elbrus. It's actually the highest peak in Europe. Mount Blanc is not the highest peak in Europe. Elbrus is, because it's on this side of the Aral Mountains. So the Arals are what divides Europe. And anyways, you didn't sign up for a geography lesson, but so I climbed this mountain, and while I was on the mountain, I felt like God gave me a vision to start taking people on outdoor adventures. So I didn't really know what I was doing, but 6 months later, or I guess it was a year later, as after I graduated college, I flew one way to Central America and took a team by ground for 4 months back to the U.S. border. And then we did another trip where we flew one way to Hong Kong and worked our way up through China, Mongolia, Western Tibet, Mount Everest, and then back to Hong Kong. And we did that for a few years.
Wow.
So, and then I got married and discovered that didn't really work very well after marriage. So shortened the trips to a week at a time now. So,
wow. Dude, that's awesome.
I mean, it sounds like a bunch of work to me to put that together. It does sound like fun. It sounds like Indiana Jones, real stuff. But my gracious, to know somebody that's actually done that.
Yeah.
So do you know someone? I'd like to talk to him.
So I'm fascinated by what you found out from Psalm 23. I've never heard that before, that the paths is talking about circular. I've never heard that before.
The rabbis say the circular means the circular patterns of the annual feasts. But I think it's bigger than that. The Apostle Paul, he talks about how Christ's love, he says, if we're out of our mind, it's for you. But if we're in our right mind, it's because Christ's love compels us. And that word compels, and again, you didn't sign up for a deep dive into language, but that word compels, it's weird because if you read it in the New International, it says constrains us. If you read it in the ESV, it says compels. And she's like, so what does it mean? The word is suneku, and it actually means to like take your hand around something and squeeze it until it pushes out. So it's like squeezing a toothpaste, a tooth. And I think that's what God does. Sometimes you're like, I don't want to do that, God. And he's like, yeah, watch this.
Yeah.
and you get pushed out. And so it's like Christ's love pushes you out to become all you're supposed to be. So at the core of who you are, the gifts and calling of God are without repentance. He likes how he made you. He wants you to become the fullness of how he made you. So what he does is, rather than just blowing you up, he slowly sends you on a circular path that's like a spiral. And you're constantly coming back to these themes, mountains or places or time frames. And you're like, oh, this again? Or like, oh, wow, it seems like every 6 years there's a change in our life. And there's these themes. Carl Jung said there's no linear evolution. There's only circumambulation of the soul. And I think that fits right in line with Christ's love compels us. Like he made us who he wants us to be, but he's going to push us a little bit at a time. His love is compelling us outward to become all we're supposed to be. So that's what the book's about, connecting the dots.
Wow.
We can talk more about that in March next year when that comes out.
Definitely.
But it's looking back at your life, how every season has prepared you for your greatest work ahead.
I love that.
Man, that is so good. I know we didn't sign up for this, but I want
more. Let's make a class.
Seriously. I mean, what a message. Who doesn't think that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't think, oh, wait a minute. I thought, why are we doing this again? I thought we made it past. I thought I matured enough to go through that again. I don't want to go through that again. And here I am. It's not the same. I mean, it's the same, but it's not the same. But it's a circle.
Yeah. And an example, my childhood, right before we moved to Guatemala, I lived in this little town called Kerrville. It was the worst experience of my little life.
There's not much in Kerrville, at least from what I remember there wasn't.
So I vowed, I was like, I'll never go back to that wretched town. And my dad was building a center on 18 acres of land. Well, here, lo and behold, during COVID, I ended up buying 16 and a half acres, 3 to 4 miles from that place. And now here I am back in Kerrville, the place I vowed I'd never come back to. Here I am again, but I know it's where I'm supposed to be. And I'm different. The world looks different. I'm going back, and I was looking at my old house the other day, and I was like, we were poor where we grew up because my dad was a pastor, and pastors are generally poor.
Yeah.
So most pastors are generally poor.
Yeah.
Some aren't. But we had it rough. And I look back and I'm like, wow, this is a beautiful area we lived in. Why did,
Yeah.
But I didn't see it for that. So it's just, God opening your eyes little by little, layer by layer, and taking you back to places you vowed never to go back to. But you're different, they're different, and there's a purpose behind everything he's taken you through.
And now you're doing hard labor there. So, I mean, what more do you want?
Paying the piper, man.
So is your dad laughing at you or with you at this point?
So I think Dad, he went in on this with me, right? And I think he literally just figured out about 3 months ago what we're doing. So like he went all in on it. But then one day he came out, he's like, this is really amazing what you've made here. I'm like, this is what I proposed. It's actually happening. He's like, wow. I'm like, you went all in on this with me on money and energy. And I was like, but anyways.
Oh man.
So he gets it now.
Yeah. Well,
Joel
we got a few minutes left here. Tell us a little bit about some of the things you guys are thinking about doing on the podcast. What you guys are working on for that.
Yes, it's just basically the podcast is just me talking to Dad about stuff. A few years ago, I had a business coach, and he's like, you need to start a podcast. And I was like, man, I don't want to start a podcast. Like, you got to come up with it's too much work. And he's like, you should get guests. And I'm like, I don't want to. I started thinking, what's the only thing I like doing on an ongoing basis that I never get tired of? And it's talking to my dad. So we just, anything that comes in my mind, I'll be like, wonder what Dad thinks about that. And I'll run it past him. And that's what the podcast is. And here, 105 episodes later, we haven't run out of stuff to talk about yet. So there's a couple themes circles that come back around. A couple themes we're constantly talking about.
Right.
But so it's the Malm podcast, the basic simple name. And it's, on all the platforms, but it's pretty much anything I think about that I'm like, wonder what Dad thinks about that. I'll run it past him, and I'll usually tell a story from childhood. And like when we have one episode where I tell a story about a time I punched a girl in the face and at church, and he was the pastor. And the dad like hauls me before the church and says, "Your son just punched my daughter in the face. What are you going to do about it?" And Dad actually let me off the hook. But anyway, we talk about stuff like that. I'm like, Dad, why'd you let me off the hook at that time? And he's like, well. So we talk about that. And wisdom.
Well, she deserved it, son.
That's right.
That's funny.
So we talk about that stuff.
Wow.
The podcast is called Malm, M-A-L-M.
Yep. The Malm podcast, M-A-L-M podcast.
And probably a link at Joel Malm. Joel
You got it.
Malm.
Yeah, Joel Malm. Anything, all that stuff's on joelmalm.com, and there's links to all of the YouVersion devotionals. I've written a bunch of YouVersion devotionals, Bible app. There's all sorts of free resources on their stuff too if you want to listen to those. So.
Hey, let's do this. Let's and I know you're busy. Let's get together again somewhere around end of October or early November, and then we are really looking for. I love the idea of this book.
Connecting the dots.
And it's in the family, right? It's a Salem book, so
yep.
It'll probably be on our website somewhere down the line. I would assume
you'll probably have access to it somehow.
Yeah. Would love that. I hope you're doing an audio version as well. Are you?
Yeah. Hopefully they'll let me actually record it this time. During COVID, they actually got. Apparently he's the voice of the Atlanta Braves, right there from your hood, man. The guy that recorded mine. Yeah. I don't know. I looked him up. I was like, who's reading my material? Because he doesn't get my humor. I can tell. So,
well, that's why it's always a great idea if they can to have the author read it themselves or do it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's I can kick and fight as much as I want, but ultimately the gods of the audio decide. So.
The gods of the audio.
Yeah.
All right, great time. Joel Malm, love it. Check out his website. Check out his dad's his podcast with his dad. His dad's name is Rick, if I remember right.
Yep,
which is
you got it.
A great name. Joel.
How did you remember that, Rick?
.com. It's a stretch at 62. Believe me. Yeah. Joel, what a blessing you are. We appreciate you. We'll visit with you again in October.
Thanks, guys.
All right, buddy. See ya. Let's take a break. We'll be right back. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
This is Faith Talk Live.